The luxury sedan pulled away from the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the morning sun as it disappeared around the corner of Fifth Avenue. Inside the lobby of Morrison & Associates, the city's most prestigious consulting firm, three impeccably dressed executives watched through the floor-to-ceiling windows, their conversations trailing off into uncomfortable silence. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Did she really just get on the city bus? Whispered Jennifer Walsh, her Hermes bag clutched tightly against her tailored blazer. In that old dress, added Marcus Chen, adjusting his platinum cufflinks. I mean, we're going to the Pentagon. The Pentagon. Sarah Mitchell had indeed walked past their waiting car service, declined their offer to share the ride, and climbed aboard the number 47 bus that wheezed to a stop right outside their building. They watched her drop exact change into the fare box, her worn leather briefcase in one hand, a simple canvas tote bag in the other. What they didn't know was that this bus ride would change everything they thought they knew about their quiet colleague from the corner office. 3 hours earlier, Sarah had stood in her small Georgetown apartment, staring at the contents of her closet. The morning briefing at the Pentagon was scheduled for 10 a.m. sharp, and she had exactly 90 minutes to get there. Her colleagues had been talking about it for weeks, the biggest contract pitch of their careers, a multi-million-dollar consultation project with the Department of Defense. The irony wasn't lost on her. 23 years ago, she had walked these same Pentagon corridors as Captain Sarah Mitchell, United States Army Intelligence. Back then, she wore combat boots instead of sensible flats, and her briefcase contained classified reports instead of PowerPoint presentations. Sarah pulled out a navy blue dress from the back of her closet. It was the same one she'd worn to her father's funeral 8 years ago, simple and understated. She paired it with a cardigan her grandmother had knitted, the one with tiny pearl buttons that had somehow survived 3 decades and countless moves. Her colleagues at Morrison & Associates wouldn't understand. They measured success in designer labels and luxury car leases, in reservations at restaurants where appetizers cost more than most people spent on groceries in a week. But Sarah had learned long ago that the most important things in life couldn't be purchased with a corporate credit card. She grabbed her briefcase, the same battered leather case she'd carried through deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq. Inside were the presentation materials she'd prepared, but also something else, a small photograph tucked into the side pocket. The picture showed her standing next to Colonel David Rodriguez, both of them dusty and exhausted, after a particularly difficult mission outside Kandahar. They'd just successfully negotiated the release of 3 hostages, a victory that had taken months of careful intelligence work and cultural understanding. The photograph was a reminder of who she used to be, and perhaps more importantly, who she still was underneath the corporate facade. At Morrison & Associates, Sarah had quickly learned to blend in. She attended the networking events, nodded appropriately during meetings about quarterly projections, and kept her military background largely to herself. Her colleagues knew she was a veteran. It was on her resume, after all, but they seemed to view it as an interesting footnote rather than a defining experience. Most of them had gone straight from Ivy League universities to consulting firms, their biggest challenges involving client presentations and office politics. Sarah's biggest challenge had been staying alive while gathering intelligence in some of the world's most dangerous places. The bus ride to the Pentagon gave her time to think. As the city rolled past her window, the familiar neighborhoods, the monuments she'd learned to see as symbols rather than tourist attractions, Sarah reflected on the strange path that had brought her here. After leaving the Army, she'd struggled to find her place in civilian life. The transition had been harder than she'd expected. The corporate world operated by different rules, valued different skills. Her ability to read people, to understand complex geopolitical situations, to remain calm under pressure. These seemed less important than knowing which wine to order at a client dinner. She'd taken the job at Morrison & Associates because she needed the health insurance and the steady paycheck. Her father had been sick, and the medical bills were mounting. The work was mind-numbingly simple compared to what she'd done in the military, but it paid well and allowed her to take care of her family responsibilities. The other passengers on the bus were a diverse mix of Washington commuters, government workers heading to their offices, service members in uniform, contractors and consultants like herself. Sarah noticed a young sergeant sitting a few rows ahead, his dress blues crisp and perfectly pressed. He was probably heading to a ceremony or an important meeting, just as she was. She remembered that feeling, the weight of responsibility that came with representing something larger than yourself. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer Walsh. "Hope you make it on time. Car service was expensive but so worth it for a client this important." Sarah smiled and put her phone away without responding. Jennifer meant well, but she had no idea what important really meant. Sarah had briefed generals and cabinet members, had provided intelligence that influenced national security decisions. This morning's presentation, while significant for the firm's bottom line, was just another Tuesday for her. The bus turned onto the highway that would take them across the Potomac River toward Arlington. Sarah could see the Pentagon in the distance, its familiar five-sided silhouette rising from the Virginia landscape. She'd driven past it thousands of times during her military career, but seeing it now brought back a flood of memories. She remembered her first day there as a young lieutenant, how overwhelming it had seemed. The building was like a small city, with its own shops, restaurants, and even a subway station. Getting lost was a rite of passage for new personnel. She remembered the sense of purpose that had filled those halls, the feeling that every decision made within those walls had consequences that rippled around the world. Her colleagues at Morrison & Associates were nervous about today's presentation because it represented the largest potential contract in the firm's history. They'd spent weeks preparing, crafting slide decks and rehearsing talking points. Sarah had watched them stress about font choices and color schemes, about whether to include certain statistics or focus on different case studies. What they didn't understand was that the Pentagon wasn't interested in fancy presentations or corporate jargon. The people who worked there dealt with life and death decisions on a daily basis. They valued substance over style, results over rhetoric. They wanted to know that the consultants they hired understood the gravity of the work, the weight of responsibility that came with advising on national security matters. Sarah understood that weight intimately. The bus made its way through Arlington, passing neighborhoods where many military families lived. Sarah had once been one of them, renting a small apartment not far from here during her Pentagon assignment. She'd walked these streets in uniform, grabbed coffee from the same shops, shopped at the same grocery stores. It was a world away from the upscale D.C. neighborhood where she lived now, where her Morrison & Associates salary afforded her a much nicer apartment than anything she'd had on military pay. But she missed the sense of community she'd felt then, the shared understanding among people who'd all taken an oath to serve something greater than themselves. At Morrison & Associates, the only oath seemed to be to the quarterly profit margins. As the bus approached the Pentagon stop, Sarah gathered her things. The photograph in her briefcase seemed to weigh more than usual, a tangible reminder of the person she'd been before she'd learned to care about client retention rates and billable hours. She wondered what Colonel Rodriguez was doing now, whether he was still serving, still making the kind of decisions that kept people safe. She stepped off the bus and walked toward the Pentagon's entrance, her worn dress and simple cardigan marking her as different from the stream of expensive suits and luxury cars arriving for the same purpose. Behind her, a taxi pulled up and her colleagues emerged, their designer clothes and nervous energy making them stand out for entirely different reasons. Sarah took a deep breath and walked through the security checkpoint, her military ID from years past making the process familiar and routine. The guards nodded respectfully, recognizing something in her bearing that her civilian clothes couldn't quite hide. She had no idea that in less than an hour, everything her colleagues thought they knew about her would change forever. The Pentagon's river entrance buzzed with its usual morning activity. Security personnel in crisp uniforms guided visitors through metal detectors, while military officers strode purposefully through the corridors, their footsteps echoing off the polished floors. The Morrison & Associates team had arrived precisely on schedule, their expensive transportation having delivered them with 5 minutes to spare. Marcus Chen straightened his tie for the third time as they waited in the visitor processing area. "I still can't believe Sarah took public transportation to the most important meeting of our careers," he muttered, checking his Rolex. Jennifer Walsh applied another coat of lipstick, using her phone's camera as a mirror. Maybe she's having financial troubles? I heard her apartment isn't in the best neighborhood. Thomas Bradley, the senior partner leading their presentation, remained focused on his tablet, reviewing their slides one final time. At 58, he'd built Morrison & Associates into one of Washington's premier consulting firms by understanding that perception often mattered more than substance. Today's Pentagon contract could set them up for a decade of government work, but only if they made the right impression. "There she is," Jennifer whispered, nodding toward the entrance. Sarah walked through the visitor checkpoint with an ease that surprised them. While they had fumbled with temporary badges and struggled to remember which pockets to empty, she moved through the process, like someone returning home after a long trip. The security guards seemed to recognize her, offering polite nods and professional smiles that suggested familiarity rather than mere courtesy. "Mitchell," Thomas called out, his voice carrying a hint of irritation. "Cutting it close, aren't we?" Sarah checked her watch. They still had 23 minutes before their scheduled appointment. "We have plenty of time, Thomas. The conference room is just a short walk from here." What Sarah didn't mention was that she knew exactly where conference room 3E924 was located. She'd attended countless briefings in that same room during her years as an intelligence officer. She knew which coffee machine worked best, which elevator moved fastest, and exactly how long it took to walk from the river entrance to the third floor of E-Ring. As they made their way through the corridors, Sarah noticed how her colleagues gawked at the paintings of former defense secretaries and the display cases filled with military artifacts. To them, this was a museum of American power, something to be admired from a respectful distance. To Sarah, these halls held memories of late-night crisis meetings, of decisions that had shaped military operations thousands of miles away. They passed a group of young officers engaged in intense discussion about logistics planning for humanitarian missions in Southeast Asia. Sarah caught fragments of their conversation: supply chain challenges, cultural considerations, coordination with local authorities. These were the same kinds of problems she'd once solved, the same type of complex thinking that her current job rarely demanded. "Impressive place," Marcus whispered, photographing a portrait of General George Marshall with his phone. "Makes you feel small, doesn't it?" Sarah smiled but said nothing. This place had never made her feel small. If anything, working here had taught her that individual contributions mattered enormously, that careful analysis and thoughtful recommendations could influence policies that affected millions of lives. They arrived at conference room 3E924 15 minutes early. Thomas used the time to arrange and rearrange his presentation materials, while Jennifer and Marcus rehearsed their talking points in hushed tones. Sarah sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, appearing calm while her colleagues radiated nervous energy. At exactly 10 a.m., the conference room door opened. The first person to enter was a woman in her 40s, wearing the uniform of an Air Force colonel. She was followed by a Navy commander, an Army major, and 2 civilians in dark suits, who had the unmistakable bearing of intelligence professionals. But it was the last person through the door who caused Sarah's breath to catch in her throat. Colonel David Rodriguez had aged well in the 8 years since she'd last seen him. His dark hair showed traces of silver at the temples, and there were new lines around his eyes. But his presence commanded the room just as it always had. He wore the uniform of a full colonel now, with ribbons and decorations that spoke of continued service in challenging assignments. He scanned the room, his gaze moving professionally across the Morrison & Associates team as Thomas made introductions. When his eyes met Sarah's, his expression shifted from polite attention to genuine surprise, then to something that looked remarkably like joy. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Ladies and gentlemen, Thomas was saying, "Thank you for this opportunity to present our capabilities to support the department's strategic planning initiatives. I'm Thomas Bradley, senior partner at Morrison & Associates, and this is my team. Jennifer Walsh, our communications specialist, Marcus Chen, our data analytics expert, and Sarah Mitchell, our administrative coordinator." The mischaracterization stung, but Sarah had grown accustomed to Thomas's habit of downplaying her contributions. In his world, former military officers were useful for their security clearances and their ability to navigate government bureaucracy, but they weren't considered strategic thinkers. Colonel Rodriguez stepped forward, his expression shifting to something Sarah recognized from their military days, the look he got when he was about to correct a significant misunderstanding. "Before we begin," he said, his voice carrying the authority that came with commanding soldiers in combat, "I'd like to address something. Ms. Mitchell, would you mind standing?" Sarah felt every eye in the room turn toward her. Her colleagues looked confused, while the military officers seemed to be waiting for something significant to happen. She stood slowly, unsure of what was coming next. "Ladies and gentlemen," Colonel Rodriguez continued, "I'd like you to meet Captain Sarah Mitchell, formerly of Army Intelligence, one of the finest officers I had the privilege of serving with during my time in Afghanistan. Captain Mitchell was instrumental in developing the intelligence framework that enabled the successful recovery of 3 American hostages in 2019, an operation that prevented what could have been an international incident." The silence in the room was profound. Thomas's mouth opened slightly as if he were trying to process information that didn't fit his understanding of his employee. Jennifer and Marcus exchanged glances that suggested they were reassessing everything they thought they knew about their colleague. Captain Mitchell's analysis of local tribal dynamics and her cultural intelligence work saved American lives, Rodriguez continued. Her recommendations influenced policy decisions at the highest levels of government. When I heard that Morrison and Associates had someone with her background on their team, I specifically requested that she be part of today's presentation. Sarah felt her cheeks flush. She hadn't expected this level of recognition, hadn't prepared for her two worlds to collide so dramatically. For 3 years, she'd been content to let her colleagues see her as they wanted to see her, competent but unremarkable, useful but not essential. The Air Force colonel spoke next, consulting a tablet in her hands. "Captain Mitchell, I've reviewed your file. Your work on cross-cultural communication protocols has become part of our standard training curriculum. Officers are still studying your reports from the Kandahar operations." "I wasn't aware you were still active in consulting work," Rodriguez said to Sarah, though his tone suggested this was as much a question as a statement. "I've been with Morrison and Associates for 3 years," Sarah replied, finding her voice, "working primarily on organizational development and strategic planning." Thomas cleared his throat, clearly struggling to regain control of a meeting that had taken an unexpected turn. "Yes, well, Sarah has been a valuable member of our team, certainly. Now, if we could begin our presentation." But Rodriguez wasn't finished. "Captain, I understand you've transitioned to civilian consulting, but I hope you haven't lost your analytical edge. The project we're discussing today involves some complex challenges that would benefit from your particular expertise." The Navy commander leaned forward. "Colonel Rodriguez has been advocating for a consultant who understands both strategic planning and cultural intelligence. Frankly, most of the firms we've interviewed talk a good game about data analysis and process improvement, but they lack real-world experience in environments where getting it wrong has serious consequences." Sarah felt something awakening inside her, a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced since leaving the military. These weren't corporate clients worried about market share and profit margins. These were professionals, dealing with challenges that mattered, decisions that could affect national security and human lives. "What kind of project are we discussing?" she asked, her voice stronger now. The intelligence officer, who hadn't yet spoken, opened a classified folder. "We're developing new protocols for interagency cooperation in crisis situations. The last few years have shown us that our current systems aren't adequate for the complexity of modern threats. We need someone who understands how different military and civilian agencies think, how they process information, and how to create frameworks that enable effective collaboration under pressure." It was exactly the kind of work Sarah had excelled at during her military career, taking complex, multifaceted problems and developing practical solutions that worked in real-world conditions. It was also exactly the kind of work that Morrison and Associates rarely encountered, the kind of challenge that required more than PowerPoint slides and corporate buzzwords. Thomas sensed an opportunity slipping away from his firm and toward his employee. "I'm sure our entire team would be delighted to contribute to such an important initiative," he said quickly. Morrison and Associates has extensive experience in organizational development and process improvement across multiple sectors. But Rodriguez was looking directly at Sarah now, and she could see in his eyes the same respect she'd earned years ago in a dusty forward operating base halfway around the world. The question he was really asking wasn't whether Morrison and Associates could handle the project. The question was whether Captain Sarah Mitchell was ready to be herself again. The conference room fell into an expectant silence as all eyes turned to Sarah. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her 8 years of careful civilian anonymity dissolving in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Thomas's carefully rehearsed presentation lay forgotten on the table while her colleagues struggled to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the decorated officer Colonel Rodriguez had just described. Sarah straightened her shoulders, feeling muscle memory kick in as she unconsciously shifted into the posture she'd maintained through countless military briefings. "Colonel Rodriguez, it's an honor to see you again. I'd be very interested in learning more about the interagency coordination challenges you're facing." The Air Force colonel, who had introduced herself as Colonel Patricia Hayes, consulted her notes. "Captain Mitchell, your report on cultural misunderstandings between American forces and local interpreters in Helmand Province was groundbreaking. We're facing similar communication breakdowns between our various intelligence agencies. Different organizations, different languages, different priorities, but the same fundamental problem of people talking past each other when lives are at stake." Marcus Chen shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The data analytics expertise he'd been preparing to showcase suddenly seemed inadequate compared to experience gained in actual life-or-death situations. Jennifer Walsh found herself studying Sarah with new eyes, wondering what other details she'd missed about her quiet colleague who brought homemade sandwiches to work and never joined them for expensive client dinners. The Navy commander, introduced as Commander Robert Sullivan, spread a series of charts across the conference table. "The situation we're dealing with involves coordination between the CIA, NSA, FBI, and multiple military intelligence branches. Each agency has its own protocols, its own way of analyzing threats, its own reporting structure. When a crisis hits, we're losing critical time trying to translate between different institutional languages." Sarah studied the organizational charts, her mind automatically beginning to identify the pressure points and communication bottlenecks. It was like looking at a familiar puzzle, complex on the surface, but following predictable patterns once you understood the underlying dynamics. "What's the typical timeline from initial threat identification to coordinated response?" she asked. "Currently, anywhere from 6 to 18 hours depending on the nature of the threat and which agency identifies it first," Rodriguez answered. "We need to cut that down to under 2 hours without sacrificing accuracy or thoroughness." Thomas Bradley watched this exchange with growing alarm. His carefully planned presentation had become irrelevant, replaced by a technical discussion that excluded him entirely. Worse, his employee, whom he'd introduced as an administrative coordinator, was clearly operating at a level that made his own expertise seem superficial. "Perhaps we should step back and discuss Morrison and Associates' overall approach to organizational development," Thomas interjected, attempting to regain control of the meeting. "We have extensive experience helping large organizations streamline their processes and improve efficiency." The intelligence officer, who had remained silent until now, looked up from his classified folder. His badge identified him as Deputy Director Marcus Webb, from the Defense Intelligence Agency. "Mr. Bradley, with respect, we've worked with numerous consulting firms over the years. They excel at identifying problems and creating impressive slide presentations, but they lack the contextual understanding necessary for this particular challenge. Captain Mitchell has actually lived these coordination failures. She's seen what happens when agencies don't communicate effectively in combat zones." Sarah felt a surge of validation she hadn't experienced in years. These weren't corporate executives impressed by jargon and cost-benefit analyses. These were professionals who understood that the difference between good intelligence work and great intelligence work could be measured in lives saved or lost. "The Kandahar operation Colonel Rodriguez mentioned," she said, her voice gaining confidence, "succeeded because we developed what we called quote, translation protocols, not just for language but for institutional thinking. The CIA prioritized long-term strategic intelligence, The army needed immediate tactical information, and local Afghan forces operated on relationship-based decision-making. We created a framework that allowed each group to contribute their strengths while understanding what the others needed. Commander Sullivan leaned forward with interest. How long did it take to develop those protocols? 6 weeks of field testing and refinement. But that was under combat conditions, with immediate feedback loops. In a domestic setting, with proper resources and cooperation from all agencies, I estimate we could develop a comprehensive framework in 3 months. Colonel Hayes exchanged glances with Rodriguez. That's significantly faster than the timeline other consultants have proposed. Most have suggested 12 to 18-month implementation periods. Sarah couldn't help but smile. Military operations don't have the luxury of extended development cycles. When you're dealing with imminent threats, you learn to iterate quickly and test solutions in real-world conditions. The key is building adaptable systems rather than rigid procedures. The room had transformed. What had begun as a standard vendor presentation had become a strategic planning session, with Sarah at the center rather than on the periphery. Her colleagues sat in stunned silence as their assumptions about hierarchy and expertise crumbled around them. Deputy Director Webb opened his classified folder wider, revealing documents marked with various security classifications. Captain Mitchell, given your clearance status, I can share some additional context. We're not just talking about theoretical coordination problems. There have been 3 separate incidents in the past 18 months where agency miscommunication led to delayed responses to credible threats. In one case, we came within hours of a significant security breach because 2 agencies were working from different threat assessments of the same intelligence. The weight of responsibility settled over Sarah like a familiar coat. This wasn't about corporate contracts or quarterly revenues. Real threats, real consequences, real people depending on getting it right. She felt the part of herself that had been dormant for 3 years beginning to wake up. What level of access would the consulting team have to classified materials and operational personnel, she asked. Full access for cleared personnel, Rodriguez replied. This project has been classified as essential to national security. The usual bureaucratic barriers have been removed. Thomas Bradley felt his control of the situation slipping away entirely. The contract he'd spent months pursuing was being offered to his employee, not his firm. Naturally, Morrison and Associates would ensure that Captain Mitchell's unique background is fully utilized while leveraging our broader organizational capabilities, he said desperately. But Colonel Hayes was shaking her head. Mr. Bradley, I appreciate your firm's interest, but we're not looking for a traditional consulting arrangement. This project requires someone who can work directly with agency heads, military commanders, and intelligence professionals. Someone who speaks their language and understands their operational realities. Based on this conversation, it's clear that Captain Mitchell possesses those qualifications. The implications hit Thomas like a physical blow. Not only was he losing the largest potential contract in his firm's history, but he was about to lose his employee to a better opportunity. Sarah's value had just increased exponentially, but not in a way that benefited Morrison and Associates. Sarah looked around the room, seeing respect and anticipation in the faces of these military and intelligence professionals. For the first time in 3 years, she felt like herself again. Colonel Rodriguez, I'm honored by your confidence in my abilities. However, I should mention that I'm currently under contract with Morrison and Associates. The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at Thomas Bradley. His face had gone pale as he realized that his treatment of Sarah over the past 3 years was about to become very relevant to very powerful people. Commander Sullivan broke the silence. Mr. Bradley, given the national security implications of this project, I'm sure you'll want to do everything possible to ensure Captain Mitchell can contribute her expertise where it's most needed. Thomas found himself in an impossible position. Refusing to release Sarah would be seen as putting corporate interests above national security. But losing her would mean losing not just this contract, but likely his most valuable employee. Sarah watched her boss struggle with the decision, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and sympathy. She'd spent 3 years being underestimated and underutilized, watching less qualified colleagues receive credit for her ideas. Now the tables had turned completely. "I think," Sarah said quietly, "we need to discuss this further." The Pentagon meeting had officially ended, but the real negotiations were just beginning. As the military officials filed out of Conference Room 3E924, they left behind business cards, classified contact information, and a standing invitation for Sarah to visit the National Security Council briefing room the following week. Thomas Bradley gathered his unused presentation materials with shaking hands, while Jennifer and Marcus sat in stunned silence, still processing the complete reversal of everything they thought they understood about their colleague. Colonel Rodriguez lingered behind as the room emptied. "Sarah, could I have a word?" She nodded, watching as Thomas reluctantly led Jennifer and Marcus toward the exit. "We'll discuss this back at the office," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "All of this." Once they were alone, Rodriguez closed the conference room door and turned to face her. The formal military bearing relaxed slightly, revealing glimpses of the friend she'd known in Afghanistan. "I have to ask, what the hell are you doing working for people who don't know what they have?" Sarah sank back into her chair, suddenly feeling exhausted. The adrenaline of recognition and professional validation was wearing off, replaced by the reality of her situation. "It's complicated, David. When I left the Army, I needed stability. Dad was sick, the medical bills were mounting, and Morrison and Associates offered good benefits and a steady paycheck. Your father, how is he?" "He passed away 2 years ago." The words came out matter-of-factly, but Rodriguez caught the flash of pain in her eyes. "I'm sorry, I should have stayed in touch better." Sarah shrugged. "Military life doesn't leave much room for maintaining civilian friendships, you know that." Rodriguez pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. "Sarah, I'm going to be direct with you. The project we discussed there? It's real, it's urgent, and it's exactly the kind of work you were born to do. But more than that, we need you. Not someone like you. We need you specifically." He turned his phone screen toward her, showing a document with an official letterhead. "This is a direct offer from the Secretary of Defense's office. Lead consultant on the Interagency Coordination Initiative, reporting directly to the National Security Council. Full security clearance reinstatement, access to resources you can't imagine, and the authority to implement real change across the entire intelligence community." Sarah stared at the screen, reading numbers that made her Morrison and Associates' salary look like pocket change. But it wasn't the money that made her heart race. It was the scope of the work, the chance to tackle problems that actually mattered. "What about my contract with Thomas?" "Legal will handle that." "Sarah, they've been treating you like an administrative assistant when you should be setting policy for the entire defense establishment. Your analysis from Kandahar is still being used to train officers at the Defense Intelligence Agency. Your cultural communication protocols have been adopted by NATO forces across 3 continents. You've been hiding your light under a bushel for 3 years." The weight of the decision pressed down on her. Taking this position would mean leaving behind the safe, predictable world she'd built at Morrison and Associates. It would mean stepping back into the arena where her decisions could have life-or-death consequences. It would mean embracing the person she'd been trying to forget. "I need time to think about this," she said finally. Rodriguez nodded, understanding. "Take all the time you need. But Sarah, don't let fear keep you from being who you're meant to be." Meanwhile, in the Pentagon parking lot, the Morrison and Associates team was having a very different conversation. Thomas paced beside their hired sedan while Jennifer and Marcus stood nearby, still trying to process what they'd witnessed. "Did you know?" Thomas demanded, turning on them suddenly. "Did either of you know she was some kind of military hero?" Marcus shook his head. "I mean, we knew she was a veteran. It was on her resume when you hired her. But she never talked about it, never made it seem like a big deal." "Never made it seem like a big deal?" Thomas's voice rose. "She apparently saved hostages and influenced national security policy, and she never mentioned it?" Jennifer was scrolling through her phone, searching for Sarah's name in military databases and news archives. "Look at this," she said, holding up her screen. "Sarah Mitchell, Captain, Army Intelligence. Decorated for valor in Afghanistan. Congressional commendation for developing new counterintelligence protocols. How did we not know any of this?" The answer, though none of them wanted to admit it, was that they'd never bothered to ask. Sarah's quiet competence and modest demeanor had made it easy to overlook her background. They'd seen what they expected to see, a veteran who needed a job, not a highly decorated officer with expertise that could command respect in the highest levels of government. Thomas slumped against the car. 3 years of careful business development, countless networking events and client dinners, all aimed at landing exactly the kind of high-profile government contract he'd just watched slip through his fingers. Worse, it had been handed to his employee, his undervalued, underutilized employee who apparently had been capable of delivering this level of work all along. "What do we do now?" Marcus asked. Thomas looked back toward the Pentagon, where Sarah was presumably still meeting with some of the most powerful people in the defense establishment. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent years trying to gain access to these corridors of power, while his employee had been taking the bus to work every day with the phone numbers of colonels and intelligence directors stored in her old military contacts. "We go back to the office," he said finally, "and we figure out how to salvage this situation." But even as he said it, Thomas knew there was nothing to salvage. The Pentagon wasn't interested in Morrison & Associates' organizational development expertise or their data analytics capabilities. They wanted Sarah Mitchell, and after what he'd witnessed in that conference room, he was beginning to understand why. Inside the Pentagon, Sarah walked slowly through the corridors she'd once known so well. The familiar sights and sounds brought back memories she'd spent 3 years trying to suppress. The sense of purpose that came with working on problems that mattered. The intellectual challenge of developing solutions under pressure. The satisfaction of knowing that her work contributed to something larger than quarterly profit margins. She found herself standing before a memorial wall dedicated to intelligence officers who had died in service to their country. Some of the names were familiar, colleagues and friends who had paid the ultimate price for their commitment to protecting others. She thought about her father, who had been so proud when she'd been commissioned as an officer, and so worried when she decided to leave the military for civilian life. "You don't have to choose between security and purpose," he told her during one of their last conversations. "But you do have to choose to be yourself." Her phone buzzed with a text message from Jennifer. "Are you okay? Thomas is freaking out back at the office." Sarah smiled and typed back, "I'm fine. See you tomorrow." But as she walked toward the exit, she knew that tomorrow was going to be very different from today. The bus ride back to the office would give her time to think, to consider the choice that lay before her. She could return to Morrison & Associates, continue working on organizational development projects for corporate clients, and pretend that this morning had never happened. Or she could step back into the world where her expertise was not just valued, but desperately needed. The number 47 bus was waiting at the Pentagon stop when she emerged from the building. The same driver from the morning shift nodded as she climbed aboard, and she recognized several of the passengers from her morning commute. But everything felt different now. The woman who had taken this bus to work that morning had been hiding from her past. The woman riding it back was finally ready to embrace her future. As the bus pulled away from the Pentagon, Sarah pulled out her phone and scrolled to Colonel Rodriguez's contact information. She stared at the screen for a long moment, then began typing a message that would change everything. The Morrison & Associates office felt different when Sarah returned that afternoon. The familiar beige walls and motivational posters about teamwork and excellence seemed smaller somehow, less significant. Her colleagues looked up from their desks as she walked past, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed resentment. Word had already spread through the office about what had happened at the Pentagon, though the details grew more exaggerated with each retelling. Sarah settled at her desk in the corner, the same desk she'd occupied for 3 years, positioned away from the windows and the prime real estate reserved for senior consultants. Her computer screen displayed 17 new emails, most of them routine administrative tasks and project updates that suddenly felt trivial compared to the morning's events. Thomas Bradley's office door remained closed, but she could hear raised voices from inside, a conference call with the firm's other partners, no doubt discussing damage control and client retention strategies. Through the glass partition, she caught glimpses of animated gesturing and what appeared to be heated disagreement. So, Jennifer Walsh appeared at her cubicle entrance, arms crossed and expression unreadable. Military hero, huh? Sarah looked up from her computer. It wasn't a secret, Jennifer. You never asked. We worked together for 3 years. We went to client dinners, company retreats, holiday parties. You never once mentioned that you'd saved hostages or briefed generals. Would it have mattered? Sarah asked quietly. Would it have changed how anyone here treated me? Jennifer opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. The honest answer was probably no. Morrison and Associates valued connections and credentials that translated directly into billable hours and client relationships. Military service, however distinguished, didn't typically open doors to corporate consulting contracts. Marcus Chen joined them, perching on the edge of Sarah's desk with the casual familiarity of someone who'd always assumed they were equals. I have to ask, if you were this big-shot intelligence officer, why are you working here? I mean, no offense, but this place isn't exactly the Pentagon. Sarah leaned back in her chair, studying her colleagues with new eyes. 3 years of shared coffee breaks and project deadlines, and they'd never really known each other at all. After my father died, I needed something stable and predictable. The military doesn't offer work-life balance or flexible schedules. This job let me take care of family responsibilities while still using some of my analytical skills. But surely you could have found something better, Jennifer pressed. With your background, you could have worked anywhere. Could I? Sarah gestured around the office. How many former military officers do you see in senior positions at consulting firms? How many women with combat experience get hired as strategic advisors rather than administrative support? This industry values MBAs from prestigious schools and family connections to corporate boards. My qualifications were seen as interesting background rather than core competencies. The truth of her statement hung in the air between them. Morrison and Associates, like most consulting firms, hired from a very specific pool of candidates. Former military officers were occasionally brought in for their security clearances or their ability to work with government clients. But they were rarely considered for leadership positions or high-profile projects. Thomas Bradley's office door opened, and he emerged looking haggard. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, and his expensive tie hung loosely around his neck. Sarah, could I see you in my office, please? She followed him into the glass-walled space that had always intimidated junior employees. Thomas closed the door and gestured for her to sit, then moved to the window overlooking the city. For a long moment he said nothing, simply staring out at the traffic below. 23 years I've been building this firm, he said finally. 23 years of networking events and client development, of building relationships and establishing credibility in this market. Do you know how long I've been trying to get a meeting with Pentagon procurement? Thomas. 4 years, he continued, not looking at her. 4 years of submitting proposals, attending defense contractor conferences, hiring retired officers as consultants. And you walk in there this morning and they practically offer you the keys to the building. Sarah remained silent, recognizing that this wasn't really a conversation. It was Thomas working through his own sense of professional inadequacy. The partners want to know why I didn't recognize your potential, he said, turning to face her. They want to know how I could have such a valuable asset on my team and fail to leverage it properly. They're questioning my judgment, my leadership, my ability to evaluate talent. You evaluated me based on the same criteria you use for everyone else, Sarah said. Revenue generation, client relationships, business development skills. My military background didn't fit those metrics. Thomas sank into his chair, suddenly looking older than his 58 years. The Pentagon contract would have set us up for the next decade. Government work, especially at that level, leads to other opportunities. Defense contractors, intelligence agencies, homeland security. It's a pipeline that could have transformed this firm. Sarah understood what he wasn't saying. Her departure wouldn't just cost them this contract. It would close off an entire sector of potential business that relied on her credentials and connections. What do you want from me, Thomas? He pulled out a folder from his desk drawer, its contents carefully organized and tabbed. Counteroffer. Senior partner track. Immediate salary increase. Equity stake in the firm. We restructure your role to focus on government consulting, build a whole division around your expertise. Sarah looked at the proposal without opening it. The numbers would be impressive, she knew. Thomas was nothing if not generous when his back was against the wall. But the offer missed the fundamental point entirely. It's not about money, she said. Everything is about money, Sarah. That's how business works. Not everything. She thought about the conversation in the Pentagon conference room, about problems that mattered beyond quarterly earnings reports. This morning, I spent 2 hours discussing how to prevent intelligence failures that could cost American lives. For the first time in 3 years, I felt like my work mattered. Thomas leaned forward, his salesman instincts kicking in. We can do important work here, too. Corporate consulting shapes economic policy, influences business decisions that affect thousands of jobs. We're making a difference. Sarah stood up, leaving the unopened folder on his desk. You're making a living, Thomas. That's not the same thing. As she reached for the door handle, he called out to her. If you leave, you'll be walking away from everything you've built here. 3 years of relationships, professional development, career progression. You'll be starting over. She paused, her hand on the door. No, Thomas, I'll be coming home. Back at her desk, Sarah opened her laptop and began composing 2 letters. The first was her formal resignation from Morrison and Associates, effective in 2 weeks. The second was an acceptance email to Colonel Rodriguez, agreeing to take the position with the Interagency Coordination Initiative. As she typed, she felt a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced in years. The woman who had taken the bus to work that morning had been living someone else's life, trying to fit into a world that would never fully appreciate who she was. The woman typing these letters was ready to embrace the person she'd always been. Her phone buzzed with a text from her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who had become like a grandmother to her after her father's death. Saw the news about the Pentagon on TV. Wasn't that your office building in the background? Hope your meeting went well. Sarah smiled and typed back. It went better than I could have imagined. I'll tell you all about it over dinner tomorrow. As the office began to empty around her, Sarah finished her letters and hit send on both. The die was cast. In 2 weeks, she would trade her corner cubicle for a secure office in the Eisenhower Executive Office Building. She would exchange corporate presentations about process optimization for classified briefings about national security threats. Most importantly, she would stop pretending to be someone she wasn't. Her computer chimed with an immediate response from Colonel Rodriguez. Outstanding news. Welcome back to the fight, Captain Mitchell. Sarah gathered her personal belongings from her desk, a few photos, her military challenge coins, the small American flag her father had given her when she was commissioned. As she walked toward the elevator, Jennifer called out to her. Sarah, wait, are you really leaving? She turned back to look at her colleagues one last time. They seemed smaller somehow, less significant than they had that morning. I'm going where I'm needed most. The elevator doors closed, and Sarah descended toward the lobby, toward the bus stop, toward a future that finally matched her capabilities. The woman who had been laughed at for taking public transportation that morning was about to become one of the most influential intelligence professionals in Washington. Sometimes the most important journeys begin with the simplest steps. 6 months later, Sarah Mitchell sat in the White House Situation Room, her security badge bearing the seal of the National Security Council and her title, Director, Interagency Coordination Initiative. The mahogany table around which she sat had witnessed decisions that shaped global history, and today she was presenting the final implementation report for the most significant intelligence reform in a generation. The president leaned forward, studying the classified briefing materials spread before him. Director Mitchell, walk me through the results one more time. I want to make sure I understand the full scope of what your team has accomplished. Sarah stood, activating the secure display screen behind her. Gone was the modest cardigan and worn dress she'd worn to that first Pentagon meeting. In their place was a sharp navy suit that commanded respect without ostentation, her bearing radiating the quiet confidence of someone who had found her place in the world. Mr. President, when we began this initiative 6 months ago, the average response time for coordinated intelligence action across agencies was between 8 and 18 hours. Today, we've achieved consistent response times of under 90 minutes, while improving accuracy and reducing redundancy. Secretary of Defense Margaret Williams nodded approvingly. The difference has been remarkable. The Syrian border incident last month, our agencies went from initial threat detection to coordinated response in 73 minutes. Under the old system, that would have taken most of a day. CIA Director Robert Harrison added, "More importantly, we're catching threats that would have slipped through the cracks before. The cultural intelligence protocols Director Mitchell developed have helped us identify patterns that individual agencies were missing." Sarah advanced to the next slide, showing a complex flowchart that represented months of careful analysis and testing. The key breakthrough was recognizing that different agencies don't just use different procedures, they think differently. CIA analysts are trained to look for long-term strategic patterns. FBI agents focus on criminal behavior models, and military intelligence prioritizes immediate tactical threats. Instead of trying to force everyone into the same framework, we created translation protocols that allow each agency to contribute their unique perspective while ensuring everyone understands the complete picture. The National Security Advisor, a former Marine general named Patricia Hayes, smiled. Sarah recognized her as the Air Force colonel from that first Pentagon meeting, recently promoted to her current position. "Director Mitchell, your work has revolutionized how we approach interagency cooperation. The Joint Chiefs are already requesting similar protocols for military operations coordination." As the briefing concluded and the senior officials filed out, the President approached Sarah personally. "Director, I understand you came to us from the private sector. Corporate consulting, correct?" "Yes, sir, Morrison and Associates." "What made you decide to return to government service?" Sarah thought about that morning 6 months ago, about the bus ride that had changed everything. "I realized I'd been trying to be someone I wasn't, Mr. President. Sometimes it takes a reminder of who you really are to find your way home." Meanwhile, across the city at Morrison and Associates, the atmosphere was considerably less celebratory. The firm had struggled to recover from losing both the Pentagon contract and their most qualified government consultant. Thomas Bradley sat in his office, reading the latest industry newsletter that featured a prominent article about Sarah's success in her new role. "Defense Intelligence Reform Credited to Former Corporate Consultant," read the headline, accompanied by a photo of Sarah briefing congressional leaders on national security improvements. The article detailed her background, her military service, and her transition from private sector consulting to becoming one of the most influential intelligence professionals in Washington. Jennifer Walsh knocked on his door, holding a similar newsletter. "Have you seen this?" Thomas gestured to his computer screen. "Hard to miss. She's become something of a celebrity in defense circles. The Wall Street Journal ran a feature on her last week. The Washington Post called her the architect of 21st century intelligence coordination." Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd recognized her potential earlier? Thomas closed his laptop with more force than necessary. Every day, we had someone with access to the highest levels of government sitting in a corner cubicle for 3 years, and we treated her like an administrative assistant. The irony was painful. Morrison and Associates had spent the months since Sarah's departure trying to rebuild their government consulting capabilities, hiring expensive former officials and retired officers who lacked both her expertise and her credibility. None of them had been able to replicate the instant respect and access that Sarah had commanded. Marcus Chen appeared in the doorway, looking uncomfortable. "Thomas, I hate to add to the pile, but I just got a call from the Department of Homeland Security. They're looking for consulting support on organizational development, and they specifically asked if we still had Sarah Mitchell on our team." Thomas laughed bitterly. "What did you tell them?" "That she'd moved on to other opportunities. They said they'd look elsewhere." It was the third such inquiry that month. Sarah's reputation in government circles had grown exponentially, and her former association with Morrison and Associates was seen as a mark of credibility. But without her, they were just another consulting firm competing for contracts based on price and generic expertise. Back at her office in the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, Sarah was reviewing applications for the Interagency Coordination Initiative's expansion program. The success of the initial project had led to requests from agencies across the federal government. And she was building a team of analysts and coordinators who could implement similar reforms throughout the intelligence community. Her phone rang, displaying a number she recognized but hadn't heard from in months. "Sarah? This is Thomas Bradley. I hope you don't mind me calling." She leaned back in her chair, looking out the window toward the White House. "Hello, Thomas. What can I do for you?" "I saw the article in the journal. Congratulations on your success. You've accomplished remarkable things." "Thank you." There was a pause. "Sarah, I've been thinking a lot about our conversation that day when you resigned. About making a difference versus making a living. I think I'm beginning to understand what you meant." Sarah waited, curious about where this was leading. "The firm isn't doing well," Thomas continued. "We've lost several major contracts, and our government consulting division never recovered from your departure. I keep thinking about the opportunities we missed, the potential we failed to recognize." "I'm sorry to hear that, Thomas. I was wondering, would you consider consulting for us occasionally? Project-based work, when your schedule permits. We have clients who specifically request expertise like yours. And frankly, we need someone who understands both the government and private sector perspectives." Sarah considered the request. The old Sarah might have felt satisfaction at being needed by the people who had undervalued her. But the woman she'd become understood something more important about forgiveness and second chances. "Thomas, I appreciate the offer, but my commitment is to government service right now. However, I might be able to recommend some qualified people for your projects. There are excellent former military officers transitioning to civilian careers who could benefit from opportunities with established firms." "That would be enormously helpful. Sarah, I owe you an apology. We should have seen what we had." "We see what we're trained to see, Thomas. The corporate consulting world values certain credentials and backgrounds. My experience didn't fit those patterns." After ending the call, Sarah returned to her application reviews. Among the candidates was a former Navy intelligence officer named Lieutenant Commander Rebecca Torres, whose resume showed impressive analytical skills but limited private sector experience. Sarah made a note to set up an interview and to mention her name to Thomas Bradley. Sometimes the best way to change a system was to help others navigate it more successfully. Her assistant knocked on the door. "Director Mitchell, Colonel Rodriguez is here for your 4 o'clock meeting." David Rodriguez entered, wearing the uniform of a full colonel and carrying a folder marked with the highest security classifications. Their professional relationship had evolved into a genuine partnership over the past 6 months, built on mutual respect and shared commitment to protecting national security. "Sarah, I have the final assessment report from the Kandahar Protocol's implementation. You're going to want to see this." He opened the folder, revealing statistics that represented more than numbers. They represented lives saved and threats neutralized. The communication frameworks Sarah had developed in Afghanistan, refined during her Pentagon project, were now being used by allied forces in 17 countries. The British are reporting a 40% improvement in joint operations effectiveness. The Australians want to send a delegation to study our methods. NATO is considering adopting your protocols as standard operating procedure for all member nations. Sarah studied the reports, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with recognition or career advancement. These improvements meant that soldiers, intelligence officers, and civilians around the world were safer because of work she'd helped create. "There's something else," Rodriguez continued. "The Secretary of Defense wants to nominate you for the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Your contributions to national security have been deemed exceptional." Sarah looked up, genuinely surprised. The Presidential Medal of Freedom was the highest civilian honor in the United States, reserved for individuals who had made extraordinary contributions to American security, world peace, or cultural achievement. "David, I'm honored, but this work was a team effort. Dozens of people contributed to these successes." "True, but you were the architect. You saw patterns others missed, created solutions others couldn't imagine, and brought together people who had been working in isolation for decades. That's leadership, Sarah. That's the kind of contribution that deserves recognition." That evening, Sarah took the bus home from work. Not because she couldn't afford better transportation, but because she'd grown to appreciate the time it gave her to think and decompress. The same route that had once carried her to an unfulfilling job now took her home from work that challenged and inspired her every day. As the bus made its familiar stops, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. 6 months ago, she'd been hiding from her past, trying to fit into a world that would never fully appreciate her capabilities. Today, she was helping to shape policies that protected millions of Americans and strengthened global security cooperation. Her phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Chen, her elderly neighbor. "Saw you on the news again. So proud of you. Dinner Sunday?" Sarah smiled and typed back, "Wouldn't miss it. I'll bring dessert." The simple exchange reminded her that success wasn't just measured in professional achievements or public recognition. It was found in the relationships that sustained you, the work that fulfilled you, and the knowledge that you were contributing to something larger than yourself. As the bus approached her stop, Sarah gathered her things and prepared to step off into the evening air. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference in ways that mattered. But tonight, she was simply Sarah Mitchell. Not the decorated veteran, not the celebrated intelligence professional, just a woman who had finally found her way home to herself. The bus pulled away, its taillights disappearing into the Washington traffic. Sarah walked toward her apartment building, past the coffee shop where she'd often sat during her Morrison and Associates days, wondering if there was more to life than corporate presentations and client entertainment. Now she knew the answer. There was always more, waiting for those brave enough to stop pretending to be someone else and start embracing who they really were. The journey that had begun with colleagues laughing at her choice to take public transportation had led her to the highest levels of American government. But the real transformation hadn't been in her career or her public recognition. It had been in her willingness to stop hiding from her own potential. Sometimes the most important victories weren't won in conference rooms or situation rooms. Sometimes they were won on ordinary Tuesday mornings, when you decided to stop apologizing for who you were and start celebrating who you could become. Sarah Mitchell had taken the bus to work as an undervalued corporate consultant. She had come home as herself. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.